Welcome to this explainer. Listen, as future educators and psychologists, you're going to wield a force so incredibly pervasive that we honestly take it for granted most of the time. Psychological testing. I mean, from the APGAR score the minute you're born to late-life cognitive assessments, our entire lives are bookended by these metrics. But what are we actually measuring? Today, we're going to use a problem-based learning approach to really dig into the mechanics, the variables, and the severe ethical stakes of psychometrics. So let me ask you this. Can a single score actually determine your destiny? We tend to view tests as, just academic hurdles or bureaucratic checkaboxes. But for the actual humans taking them, the stakes can be astronomically high. Let's look at the real-world problem we're dealing with here. To truly grasp the gravity of this, let's run through 4 quick case histories. First, imagine a shy, withdrawn 7-year-old girl. She gets an unexpectedly high IQ score, is moved into a gifted program, and absolutely blossoms into a confident scholar. Her entire life trajectory was elevated by a single metric. Second case, a family living right next to a toxic lead smelter. Psychological testing proved their kids suffered actual neurological damage, which secured them an $8 million settlement. That is justice literally quantified. Third, we have a police candidate. Looks amazing on paper, but a personality inventory flags him as dangerously impulsive. That test likely saved the public from a disastrous hire. But, it doesn't always end well. Our fourth case is a college student who takes a vocational interest test that points her toward pharmacy. She hates it. She spends 3 miserable years studying before abandoning it for dance. She wasted immense time and money all because of a flawed assessment. See, these aren't just numbers on a page. They're life-altering pivots. And that is exactly why we have to rigorously understand the concepts behind these tools. All right, let's transition into the anatomy of a test and break down these metrics. Here is your foundational definition. A psychological test is a standardized procedure for sampling behavior and describing it with categories or scores. Now pause right here because I want you to mark this down as a massive, high-yield misconception for your exams. Testing is absolutely not the same thing as assessment. Assessment is the whole picture. It's the interviews, the behavioral observations, the patient history. A test? Well, a test is just one single standardized tool sitting inside that much broader assessment toolbox. For any test to actually maintain validity, it relies on 5 critical components. You've got standardization, behavior sampling, scoring, norm referencing, and predicting non-test behavior. Let's isolate that first one, standardized procedure. Think about the Wayside block design test. The manual lays out a highly complex flow of exactly how the examiner has to react. If an examiner decides to be nice and offer a little extra help, or even just changes one word in the instructions, well, they haven't just tweaked the test. They have entirely invalidated the resulting score. It's useless. So once we actually have a valid score, how do we interpret it? You absolutely must understand the conceptual difference between these 2 frameworks. Norm-referenced tests compare the examinee to a standardization sample. Basically, an IQ test grading you against your peers. Criterion-referenced tests, on the other hand, measure performance against a very tightly defined objective threshold, completely ignoring the peers. Think of a math test where you just have to hit 95% accuracy to pass, regardless of how anyone else did. Moving right along, let's explore the broad categories and applications we use to measure the mind. To build a strong mental framework here, let's use a chunking strategy. We can group hundreds of different assessments into 3 main conceptual buckets. First up, cognitive tests. This includes intelligence and aptitude, and they measure global capacity and specific skills. Second, we have personality and interests. These measure individual traits and preferences to help predict future behavior. And finally, behavioral and neurogests. These are used to identify things like frequencies of behavior, novel thinking, or even pinpointing brain dysfunction. But what happens when the system breaks? Let's talk about the human variable. Let's look at the actual evidence regarding test anxiety. In a classic 1956 study, a researcher named Sigmund asked a brilliant question. How does time pressure actually affect anxious subjects? He took low anxious and high anxious subjects who had the exact same baseline intellectual ability. The findings? Totally stark. On strictly timed subtests, that ticking clock literally paralyzed the anxious minds, and their scores dropped. But, and here's the crazy part, on untimed subtests, the high anxious subjects actually scored higher.
The takeaway here is that the human variable of anxiety completely confounds our measurement of cognitive ability the second we introduce a time limit.
Now let's widen the lens and look at culture and bias, specifically the social context of testing. Okay, consider this groundbreaking data from Terrell and colleagues back in 1981. They tested African American college students who reported having either low or high levels of cultural mistrust toward white individuals. When they were tested by an African American examiner, the high mistrust students scored an average IQ of 96. But when that exact same demographic was tested by a white examiner, their average IQ plummeted to 86. That is a 10-point drop. The test wasn't suddenly measuring less intelligence, it was measuring the invisible social friction in that specific room. And this friction leads directly into a hugely high-yield concept you'll see all over your exams: stereotype threat, conceptualized by Claude Steele. It's essentially the psychological burden a person feels when they're at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about their own group. It acts like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Instead of allowing working memory to focus purely on the test items, it gets completely flooded with anxiety. Steele and Aronson's 1995 methodology proved this beautifully. When a difficult verbal test was framed to the students merely as a challenge, that was the control group, both racial groups performed similarly. But when that exact same test was framed as being diagnostic of individual verbal ability, boom, it triggered stereotype threat. The African American students' scores dropped sharply. The framing alone dictated the cognitive efficiency of the people taking the test. Incredible, right? So, let's transition into the ethical implications. This is the dark side of high-stakes testing. To apply our decision framework, just look at this historical advertisement from an old pop psychology magazine for a software program called Mind Prober. It literally promises to scientifically uncover people's hidden weaknesses and sexual interests in minutes. I mean, no way, right? This is a blatant, highly dangerous commodification of psychological assessment. It's exactly the kind of irresponsible charlatanism that our professional standards are built to defend against. To combat that kind of nonsense, professional organizations enforce very strict principles of responsible test use. And yes, this is essential application knowledge for your licensing exams. The absolute overriding rule: you act in the client's best interest. You have to maintain confidentiality, though there are specific legal exceptions, like the duty to warn, which you'll remember stems from the famous Tarasoff case. Beyond that, you need informed consent. You must ensure your own certified expertise, and you have to avoid obsolete tests. For example, using the original MMPI today instead of the current MMPI-2, that isn't just a mistake, it's considered professional malpractice. But ethical breaches don't just happen with individual rogue practitioners. They happen on a massive institutional scale, when the stakes of testing become directly tied to funding. This leads to something called the Lake Wobegon effect. Now, by statistical definition, on a norm reference test, 50% of people must score below the 50th percentile. That's just math. Yet, virtually every single state in the US claims their school system's average scores exceed the 50th percentile. This statistical impossibility heavily hints at widespread, educator-led manipulation of the data. And that statistical impossibility, it builds into an undeniable systemic pattern. When society attaches massive, life-changing rewards to high scores, people will cheat the system. Just look at this timeline. 30,000 scores canceled in China in 1994. Stolen exams in Louisiana in 97. Teachers literally altering math tests in NYC in 99. In 2011, you had 178 educators orchestrating a massive, decade-long fraud in Atlanta. Even medical boards aren't immune. Doctors were caught building huge databases of recalled test questions. The higher the stakes, the greater the corruption of the metric itself. So, we've seen that a psychological test is this incredibly powerful, highly structured tool. It's fully capable of identifying hidden genius and guiding careers. Yet, we've also seen how easily this exact same tool can be completely warped by human anxiety, contextual friction, and outright systemic fraud. As we continue to weave these admittedly imperfect metrics into the very fabric of our institutions, we have to stop and ask ourselves, when a score is compromised by the immense pressure we place on it, who is really failing the test? Is it the individual examinees, or is it the system itself? Your one-sentence takeaway today is this: psychological tests are powerful, standardized tools, but their validity is constantly threatened by human variables and systemic stakes. Always keep questioning the data. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.